I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. Today, we're going to be covering a few different topics. First, Will is going to walk us through the backlash against Trump for welcoming in some white South Africans, God forbid. Ben will talk us through the latest in terms of legal challenges to the Alien Enemies Act. One federal judge has now approved the use of that for Trump. I will go over Trump's new executive order lowering drug prices through favored nation status. And Inez will close us out with DEI employers facing discrimination charges. So with that, I will kick it to Will to start us off.
Yeah, so the Trump administration made a bunch of news this week. I believe it was 2 days ago, so Monday, but they admitted 50 refugees from South Africa, white Afrikaner refugees, into the country. One of the members of the State Department, I think it was Chris Landau, was at Dulles to welcome them. And, you know, they're all waving American flags, and it looked great. And it's amazing how admitting 50 refugees, if they're the wrong type of refugees, can just completely send the left spiraling. It's really remarkable. There was a great tweet from Matt Iglesias where he said, guys, this is bait. Calm down. Like, don't respond to this. And the left couldn't help themselves. We get a whole bunch of talk about how they aren't really refugees, that they don't deserve to come here. And I think the most notable statement of all came from the Episcopal Church, which had been working in refugee resettlement for quite some time, saying that they were suspending their refugee resettlement program rather than helping these 50 people get settled in the United States. First off, these people are very clearly refugees. If you haven't been following what's going on in South Africa for the last decade and a half, probably, the South African government they face both overt, explicit discrimination, attempts to expropriate their land from them on the grounds that white people have too much land, in effect. And they've faced enormous numbers of murders. It is fundamentally unsafe for them. The South African government does a terrible job of protecting them from violence. And in some cases is sort of urging them on. And then you've got the leader of a major party, Julius Malema, who sings the song "Kill the Boer," referring to the Afrikaner population. So you've got genocidal songs, you've got land expropriation, you've got all sorts of things that would make you think these people are certainly refugees. The South African government tried to contest that they were refugees in a statement put out by the ANC. That statement suggested that they are not refugees, they are not being persecuted, but rather they being held accountable for their privilege. Bizarre thing to say about children and just random farmers. So, and the kind of thing that makes you think, oh, wait, actually, these people are, in fact, being persecuted. And if you want to reach out to the ANC about it, you should reach out to a guy named Stalin, who is the press contact on that press release. The fact that the left can't handle this, and the fact that all these refugee organizations are throwing their hands up in disgust, is an indication that we're onto something and we need to do something more here. You know, I think I tweeted out something along the lines of, we should be admitting as many Afrikaner refugees as we can, and we should be insisting that anybody taking a federal grant for refugee resettlement be focused on resettling these Afrikaner refugees. Indeed, they should probably be forced to learn Afrikaans so they can more effectively communicate with the Afrikaner refugees to help them. I want to make these people miserable. If they are so upset by the idea that they might help a white person resettle, that a white person might be being persecuted, and that could be their job from now on, or they can stop taking any federal money whatsoever. And I think, I'm a big time believer in making the left feel the pain of their own rules. I don't know why the left feels these rules are painful, but clearly they do. The idea of taking African refugees is just beyond the pale for them. Great. That's all we should make sure that's the entire refugee population from here on out.
There's some even funnier phrases in my view in this statement by the African National Congress. It says that they're declining to be transformed, and that's the reason that they're leaving, is they decline the transformation. I mean, really like Orwellian language. And as Will pointed out at the bottom, the press contact, his nickname is Stalin. That sounds actually like what our refugee program is supposed to be for. It's supposed to be for small numbers of people suffering severe political persecution. Like that's the point of this essentially loophole in the American immigration system, right? Not millions of people who are essentially doing economic migration. And frankly, these kinds of claims are, exactly what the law is supposed to be for, not for gang-related papusa stand sort of situations like Abrego Garcia. Those things are sort of endemic violence, or in this case, gang-related violence, right, to these nations. It's supposed to be for political persecution. These programs were designed during the Cold War to take essentially anti-communist dissidents in many cases. But yes, this is what this program is for. It is the left's reaction to this. It's funny that somebody on the left, you said Maddie Iglesias, is like, wait, guys, stop. It's just too revealing of the way that they actually think, which is they divide people into racial classes and they have oppressors and oppressed. And these people cannot possibly be refugees because they're in the oppressor class. They're white. And this kind of thinking is just shot through with all of the immigration debates. There's, for example, a similar kind of debate happening in Europe where Poland took an enormous number of Ukrainian refugees during the war, especially at the height of the war, right, 22 through 24. They took an enormous, huge number, almost 2 million for a country that's like 44 million people. So, a huge number of those refugees, but that didn't count, quote unquote, for the EU because they weren't taking their selected number of refugees that were mostly coming from, Muslim North Africa. Right. So because they took refugees who are actually from the country next door with a similar language, some overlapping cultural customs and so on, and who are actually assimilated fairly well into their culture, that didn't count as taking refugees, even though there is a huge land war on their border. And that's kind of the original idea that everyone had about refugees. So, yes, I mean, full steam ahead with this. This is what the refugee program is for. Like Will said, the people coming here are coming here waving American flags. There was some very funny stuff on Twitter with people quoting, "This is not what a refugee looks like." No, that's exactly what refugees look like before our programs were abused. Families with lots of women and children happy to be here waving the American flag. Like that is the purpose of the program. Those are the sorts of people that Americans want to welcome when they're being persecuted and their lives are being threatened in their home countries. So yeah, full steam ahead on this one.
Yeah, I remember when the refugee program during the Afghanistan withdrawal was taking place, they were, of course, allowing thousands of people in with practically zero vetting, certainly no vetting to see whether they were ideologically aligned with the culture of the United States. And within several months, I recall that there were multiple incidences on these military bases where the refugees were being housed. One was a case of domestic violence of a man against his wife, and the other one was of a man who was sexually assaulting young boys. And no one stopped to question why this was acceptable, why these individuals had been given priority refugee status. And of course, the question is because it was politically expedient for Joe Biden to try to clean up the Afghanistan mess by allowing as many individuals affected by it to come to the US without any questions asked. But now you look at a group of people who solely because they're white, even though they are actually persecuted, aligned with the cultural values of the United States, would actually benefit the United States by being here, that suddenly is a huge problem. And it's a minuscule amount, by the way, compared to the number of Afghanistans that we brought over during the withdrawal process. The Episcopal Church, which has been one of the chief organizations responsible for resettling refugees, now says they're not going to do it anymore because it's so beyond the pale for them to help resettle 50 white people, when for decades they've been happy to take in anyone and everybody who claims refugee status, even if it's incredibly dubious, which I think really just gives the whole game away.
Yeah, obviously this shows the racism and bigotry inherent to the left, and it's striking, stepping back for a second, to the extent that I have the accounts of what the South African regime looks like accurate. when you think about it, basically they've gone to the logical conclusion of where progressives are on race. I mean, they take the ideology to its natural endpoint, which is about expropriation and systematic discrimination up to and including bodily harm, executing bodily harm against those who are the wrong race for their purported alleged past sins of these individuals, basically baked into their skin color or associated with it. So striking here, I haven't heard necessarily the Democrats yet defending the South African regime, but we're probably not that far from it. And obviously, the split screen here is rich. At the very same time, this is going on where you have people who, by all accounts, are seriously persecuted. First of all, the left was up in arms over the Trump administration essentially suspending refugee resettlement. These are refugees. Why don't you want them resettled? Then you have representatives and a mayor in a close by city of my own storming an ICE detention facility, acting lawlessly in support, essentially, in defense of hardened criminal illegal aliens. We can go back with the Democrats even to Elian Gonzalez, for example. Not everyone's created equal when it comes to the left, and clearly what they prioritize ultimately is skin color because of what it signifies, what it represents, and it's not about the merits. It's not about who actually has a more compelling case, what the national interest of the country demands. At the end of the day, for them, it's obviously about politics, and so this looks like fighting fire with fire here, and the fact that they're twisting themselves in knots over this, I think, does show the brilliance of it on the political grounds, but it's also merited. There's also a class of people that actually deserve relief, but the left doesn't think so, apparently.
And we're going right back to you, Ben, for the latest on the Alien Enemies Act.
Yeah, so in some ways, kind of a perfect segue where you obviously do have the left defending criminal illegal aliens and such. And we talked about the Alien Enemies Act in a prior episode, and there have been at least 3 different federal judges who have, in one way or another, invalidated the president's proclamation that Tren de Aragua terrorists from Venezuela constitute those executing a foreign entity that's executing an invasion or a predatory incursion. Those are the technical terms under the Alien Enemies Act, and that consequently, under the Alien Enemies Act, when invoked, they can be subject to almost immediate removal from the country. So again, several judges, including one Trump-appointed judge in Texas, have challenged the proclamation. And there are a few different legal elements at play here, stepping back from the fact that this policy is really, at the end of the day, about trying to reverse the effects of an invasion, at least as colloquial understood, whether or not a federal judge agrees with the definition or not. Can the president use every lever of power to repel an invasion and then to reverse the effects of an invasion? And so there are a few questions, legal questions, that stem from that sort of basis in these cases. One of which is, can a federal judge even look at a president's decision to invoke the Alien Enemies Act here and invalidate it? Because Congress delegated the president the power to declare that we are facing war or threat of war, invasion, or predatory incursion, and then invoke the act to quickly expedite the removal of enemy aliens to the country. The courts, in every case thus far, have said that essentially they can look to what the president says in his proclamation for declaring this class of people alien enemies, and then see whether the proclamation is applicable here. So a judge can say, essentially, whether or not the president has at least justified the idea that we're facing invasion or predatory incursion from a foreign entity or foreign government-directed entity. And so that's what's been litigated in these cases. What's the definition of invasion or predatory incursion? Has the president justified his argument that Tren de Aragua is engaged in an invasion or predatory incursion on behalf of the Venezuelan government? And then, essentially, are the acts subsequent to that appropriate? And there have been challenges, of course, on what kind of notice do you have to give these individuals, how much time, etc. But in any event, 3 judges, again, including a Trump-appointed one, said the proclamation was not legitimate, that we are not facing a predatory incursion or an invasion. Now a federal judge out of, I believe, the Western District of Pennsylvania has said actually that first of all, the courts can engage in judicial review of the proclamation, but that the proclamation is legitimate. And here's essentially how the judge justifies this decision beyond looking to what was the definition of invasion or incursion in 1798 and that era in trying to understand what the original meaning of the text was beyond the precedent that's involved in this. This federal judge says basically that the designation of a foreign terrorist organization for Tren de Aragua is a significant piece of evidence justifying the notion that this is a predatory incursion. And she writes this in her, I think, 40 plus page ruling, quote, is a duly designated foreign terrorist organization that, according to the proclamation, enters the U.S. for purposes such as destabilizing the country, committing rampant crime, funneling profits from that crime back to South America, among other things, not the very definition of a cohesive group entering territory with a common and significant destructive purpose. Just as a detachment of a military in 1798 is such an FTO, foreign terrorist organization, not the modern equivalent of enemies, pirates, and robbers committing incursions around the enactment of the AEA. And then she also asked the rhetorical question, if FTOs existed and were entering the United States in 1798, would the public and Congress have viewed those FTOs as committing predatory incursions against the territory of the United States? And she says, yes. So this was the first ruling that validates the proclamation. The Supreme Court itself has not ruled one way or another whether the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act under the proclamation is kosher. Essentially, what the court said was you have to provide some more substantial due notice and that these cases are to be dealt with in habeas, that is, where you are held, that's where you bring your case. So now I think that we have competing rulings out of different federal courts. Presumably, first of all, we haven't had appeals, but I assume we will have appeals in relatively short order on both sides, and maybe the lawyers here can weigh in on why we haven't quite seen them yet. But then ultimately, because you have these differing views from different federal judges, and we'll see where the appellate courts go, this, I think, is starting to put us on a faster, more accelerated track, ultimately, probably to the Supreme Court ruling on this. And it's going to be fascinating to see what SCOTUS says about where judicial review lies here, and then whether this has been a properly substantiated or justified proclamation. I still think the first question is, why does a judge have a right to review this? There's Supreme Court precedent on this, which says that as to matters of constitutionality and interpretation, there is the ability for judicial review. And then obviously there's an ability to review the underlying cases. That is this person actually an alien enemy or not? But I'm curious what you guys think. What do you make of the significance of this ruling, and where do you think this is ultimately heading, and how fast do you think it's heading there?
I think it's really important that that pirate argument was made, not just for the Alien Enemies Act case, but also for potentially the birthright citizenship case, because one of the parallels that the DOJ has been making in its arguments to get rid of birthright citizenship is that the statute obviously doesn't apply to like invading armies or, in the olden analogy, pirates. People who weren't necessarily part of a state-sanctioned invasion, but still wouldn't be given the right of having a child born on the land that it's invading be granted automatic citizenship. And so if the courts are amenable to that argument on the Alien Enemies Act case in terms of removals, then it would stand to reason that they would be amenable to that in terms of birthright citizenship as well. So the idea that an illegal alien invader who is comparable to a pirate would have their child be given automatic citizenship by nature of being born on that land would be in serious question. So that's really interesting to me, that particular judgment. But on the broader issue, I mean, all of the quibbling, of course, over whether or not the Venezuelan president effectively has to have a written down order for Tren de Aragua to be operating in the U.S. extrajudiciously in order for Trump to reasonably declare this an invasion or even the group a foreign terrorist organization has entirely missed the broader point. And so it's nice that we finally have one judge who kind of gets it.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the word invasion, yes, I mean, especially considering the fact that like we're not in modern army communication, obviously, is a very recent development, right? You have a lot of small bands operating entirely independently back in the 1700s. But even if that were not the case, right? Like, even if we grant that this is maybe not exactly what people consider, this is a bit of a stretch with invasion, even if we grant that for the sake of argument, that's how the statute is written. And that's how American governance has operated for the last half century, is through vague statutes that have words like invasion and leave it to the executive branch to essentially fill in all of the important details, some of which make the entire difference in the matter, right? And that's how Congress has been legislating for quite some time. And frankly, again, like Will said, right, the best way to get a serious reconsideration of the rules that we've been governed under for the last 50 years is actually enforce them against the left. If the left doesn't like governance by vague statute by the executive branch, then they're free to actually legislate. Congress is free to actually legislate, right? So yes, Anyway, I think they have a fairly strong case on invasion. I think this judge lays it out well on the parallels to pirate bans, as Amber said, that has implications on the birthright citizenship case. But I also think this is just how American governance has operated. I mean, to the point, in a much more stretched way by most Democratic administrations. I mean, discrimination on the basis of sex became gender identity under the executive branch operated by Obama, right? So surely, if you can stretch sex into self-determination and self-identity, then surely invasion can cover organized bands of designated terrorist group sort of gangs coming from Latin America and organized incursions into the United States. And that's kind of the point, right? Would I prefer to live in a world where in the constitutional universe where Congress makes the law with specificity and the executive branch enforces the law with specificity, right? Like, yes, but that's not the world we've lived in forever. And if we want to return more towards a constitutional system, this is a much stronger case than most of the left has in terms of stretching words to basically put in their agenda, like wiggle their agenda into various statutes. And that's how they've governed for 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously happy to finally see us win a ruling here, but I mean, it should have happened before. That judge in Texas who came down the other way, I wrote a bizarre and really quite silly opinion, in my view, trying to say that, he had the right to determine what constituted a war and when an incursion happened. Again, the judiciary doesn't have an intelligence service. This is not within their competence. It's something it's just a political question that they obviously should be deferring to the executive branch on. But I'm happy to see that another judge has seen things very differently. I think it's the obvious answer here. And, it's a reminder there was a discussion where, John Roberts tried to say the primary job of the judiciary is to check the other branches. Incorrect. The job of the judiciary is to uphold the law and sometimes to uphold what the executive branch is doing when they're acting lawfully. So, judiciary needs to get it through its head. We're not in a juristocracy and their job is not to run the country.
All right, I am now going to cover Trump's executive order on lowering drug prices, which effectively gives the United States, or attempts to give the United States, favored nation status when purchasing pharmaceutical products, meaning they have to be offered at the same price that it is offered to other countries, like in Europe or Canada. So if Germany gets an EpiPen for $80 and the United States citizens have to pay $300, they would now be charged $80. I'd love to hear from the group later on about the legality of this, the ability of it to actually be enacted, but I'll just walk through some of the arguments in favor and perhaps the political ramifications. I got to argue about this with a libertarian yesterday, which is great because the libertarians, of course, are calling this price controls, which, like, I guess is technically accurate. But when you're talking about the healthcare industry and the pharmaceutical industry specifically, like, first of all, you're talking about inelastic goods, right? Like inelastic demand for goods. People don't have a choice whether or not to buy insulin, for example. So it does not operate in a traditional free market framework. So approaching it that way, as if like the pharmaceutical companies just all need to compete with each other and everything will be fine and prices come down, is an incredibly overly simplistic and naive way of looking at this specific issue. Second, the US government, with the help of American taxpayers, funds a significant portion of research and development of all of these drugs. So the American taxpayer makes it possible for pharmaceutical companies to unveil these technologically advanced drugs and other medical devices and things related to that greatly benefit the populace, but they don't get the benefit of enjoying a low price on those products. They end up having to pay exorbitant prices for the very things that they provided the funding for their development and manufacturing, while in the third point, subsidizing the low prices offered to other countries. So because Europe has socialized medicine, or because they have price controls on their drugs that are imported, the American people then have to make up the apparent profit deficit from the pharmaceutical companies by paying much higher prices, even though they're the ones, again, who funded the research and development of them. So the entire thing is kind of a scam. And part of it is driven, the one pro-libertarian point I would give them on this issue is that there is one market-based solution, which is that if you send insulin to Germany and they pay $80, you can't just ship that $80 priced insulin back to the United States and allow Americans to pay that price for it. That's actually banned under FDA regulations. So we have to pay the $300 and watch as the cheaper product gets shipped overseas, and we're not allowed to just ship it back for the same price. I mean, the whole thing is a racket. It's a scam. So I think Trump's it's basically a pressure campaign, this executive order, I would say, because he basically threatens the pharmaceutical companies. If you don't lower prices for Americans down to other favored nations, then we are going to go through a process of basically either one, further capping prices through Medicare and Medicaid, which would obviously hurt their bottom line. I think another mechanism would be to remove that FDA regulation that prohibits the reshipping of some exported drugs back to the United States at those lower prices, which would be a huge problem for the pharmaceutical companies. But again, I want to hear from the group on what you think about this order and its legality. I mean, one final point I'll make on the political ramifications is that the Democrats took this huge victory lap about Biden capping the Medicare Medicaid price of insulin, but didn't do anything about the broader explosion of pharmaceutical prices in the United States. And he was hailed as like this hero that had saved healthcare effectively and was saving seniors from exorbitant costs. Trump has actually done something much more comprehensive than that and really gotten to the root of the problem of why drugs are so expensive in the United States. And so he's just taken that entire calling card away from the Democrats, which I think is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, I think I would have liked to see Trump do this through trade negotiations and not through executive order, because they did something very similar in Trump 1 and they lost in court under separation of powers grounds. I think they're likely to lose again, and probably for good reason. But because fundamentally the structure of this problem, right, is very much more like NATO than it is like an actual economic problem within the borders of the United States. The problem is, and the drug companies do have a point here, they spend an enormous amount on research and development. And oftentimes I find people on the left, or even people defending Trump now on this order, are being a little disingenuous, because they'll say like, oh, like this is how much it costs them to develop this one drug, and this is what they're selling it for, and it's exorbitant. But they're not accounting for the other, 19 drugs at trials that were funded and failed. So it is kind of a huge upfront investment for a lot of these companies. They do have big profit margins though. So it's not like they're scraping by. They do have large profit margins, but there is a real argument there about research and development. They have to fund 20 drugs to get one successful drug, right? And it is very expensive. And the question then is, who is paying for, paying for that research and development? And it is America, where basically the drug companies are funding all this research, creating these drugs to sell these drugs to the American market at a very high price. And then as a bonus, they're selling into all these other markets, right, at this very, very reduced cost because their single payer systems negotiate drug prices as a collective. So to me, it looks much more like the NATO problem. I would have liked to see this, and maybe it is going to be part of some of these, renegotiations of various trade duties. To me, this is much more of a conversation of like trade deficits, of tariffs. Like it's in that same category of how to stop basically a bunch of European countries and others from freeloading off of the United States, whether that's security or drug prices. So that's the context I'd like to see that happen in. I do think at the end of the day, what Amber said is true. I think this is really like a challenge and a pressure point. I think they're trying to pressure the Dems into voting for the big, beautiful bill. And to specifically, there's a provision in budget negotiations that deals with this, and that would put it into law that would solve the constitutional problems, the separation of powers problems, right? Congress is looking at this. And of course, it's something that Bernie Sanders has been calling for decades. So I think it's intended to shame Democrats into potentially at least voting for this amendment in the bill or something like that. So I think there's something going on vis-a-vis the executive and the legislative branch on this topic. Just one more note about this. That backup price, the most favored nations price, is after negotiation. So the EO is structured so that basically is requiring drug companies to go into negotiation with the U.S. government over the price, drop their prices, and if they don't, adequately drop their prices through those negotiations and the determination of the U.S. government, then the U.S. government will pay the price, and then it is really like a price cap, right? Like we're basically capping the price that they're selling into other countries. I don't know if that will work very well, again, because that price probably doesn't fund research and development. They probably have a good point about it being totally pointless to fund drugs at that price. That the question is much more about who's bearing that cost and how that cost is distributed among people who are buying this drug, of us versus other countries. And I think that's more the way to think about this question.
Yeah, and I mean, even it's more than just the research and development gets covered because, Americans are like the primary market for the drugs, but also we spend hundreds of billions of dollars through federal grants for research and development every year as well. So there is this direct cost cutting measure for these companies. And they also get, I think, a 10% at least tax credit on research and development too. So they're basically getting 50 to 60% of their costs covered by the taxpayer.
It is worth pointing out, like in the larger context of this, we're talking about brand new drugs, right? Once the drugs go to generic, the US pays low prices. In fact, I think many cases lower prices because we have more of a free market here for those drugs.
Yeah.
Once generic, the US has low price. It's about drugs in that 7-year period, often and that's why the research and development, is so heavily a part of this discussion, because we're talking about brand new developed drugs for the most part.
And patents play a part in it too, because there are some drugs where you can't have a generic or the competition is severely limited because of the IP law.
I think sorry, I just got suddenly realized I needed to start talking. So I think this executive order is very good. There's a sort of free market argument being made that it's like, well, otherwise these drugs won't get developed in the future. But I think the real question and the real thing that makes this work is that it's not about saying we're going to pay less than every country in the world, because clearly there are some poor countries that will want a discount, but we shouldn't be paying less than the other OECD countries. All the wealthy countries need to be paying their fair share. And the status quo is that they free ride off of American consumers. They free ride, they negotiate very low prices for their own consumers and then rely on us to bear the burden of R&D. That's just can't be the way things work, not for the development of these more important medicines.
So whether the executive order is the right vehicle or will withstand scrutiny of the courts, et cetera, obviously Trump won. There were issues. I'm not sure how much those were technical or process issues versus substantive issues of the government being able to use its heft and might and leverage to be able to negotiate because of the massive purchasing power that effectively the government has on our behalf through entitlements. But I will say that the argument, the quote unquote, the free market argument, to the extent is that, well, the government shouldn't be involved in this. I think is rich because effectively that position says government can't do anything more in one of the most hyper regulated industries in the world, which basically means you're defaulting to the already statist kind of position. So I don't think that the libertarian argument is actually a libertarian argument. If you want to have the argument, let's have a free market in healthcare, and here's all the things that a free market in healthcare ought to consist of, sure, that's a great argument to have. But under the current paradigm that exists, I think it's eminently reasonable for the administration to try to use whatever levers it has to ensure that the American people aren't ripped off and taken advantage of, and especially that it benefits other countries, including in some cases, adversaries. And I just one point on that. If you look to the text of the executive order, there's a section addressing foreign nations freeloading on American finance innovation. And it says in part, it directs in part the Commerce Secretary and the U.S. Trade Representative to take measures to ensure foreign countries not only are not engaged in any act, policy, or practice that might be unreasonable or discriminatory, but any act that may impair United States national security and has the effect of forcing American patients to pay for a disproportionate amount of global pharma R&D, et cetera, by suppressing prices abroad. So I do wonder, to what extent is there going to be a focus on China, a nexus to China, and of course there ought to be a much broader focus on reshoring so that we don't have the issue of essential basic medicines all being produced by our worst adversary that's going to use that as a lever against us in the future, as they did during COVID.
And for our final segment before final thoughts, Inez is going to walk us through DEI employers facing discrimination charges.
Yeah, so more great news on what we might broadly call the war on woke part of the Trump administration that really has been just night and day with Trump 1 in terms of coming in prepared. I've been sort of waiting for this to happen and kind of curious as to why it hasn't happened yet. And now finally we do see Title VII charges coming out of the EEOC under Trump. If you've been following some of the war with the universities, most of the funding pulls from universities have been based on Title IX. They've been based on Title VI, the former being on the basis of discrimination on the basis of sex. So if you allow men to compete against women in your swim team, that's the grant basis for pulling the grant from University of Pennsylvania. And so they've been then Title VI famously used against Columbia for actions against Jewish students for failing to prevent discriminatory actions against Jewish students. So this actually, the Title VII ground, I thought was kind of both politically and legally the most fertile ground for going after universities and, interestingly, private companies with regard to DEI policies. So unlike in the admissions context, where affirmative action was, sort of temporarily, there was a 25-year time clock attached to it, but temporarily okayed constitutionally by the Supreme Court until the Students for Fair Admissions decision a couple years ago. In the hiring context, in the hiring, promotion, any actions related to hiring, firing, promotion, compensation, all of those workplace matters, you were never allowed to take race into account. You weren't even allowed to put a thumb on the scale, right, is the phrase that gets used and thrown around by the EEOC. The only limited action, and this is something that even the more liberal members of the EEOC, again, will admit if pushed to the wall on Title VII, the only thing that was legal was so-called broadening your applicant pool. So like you can go to a bunch of minority or majority minority high schools, right? And try to get the kids excited and enrolled in a STEM program or something. And then, take hoping that more of them will be qualified applicants for your company, 10 years down the line. That you can do. But what you can't do, and was always illegal, despite how totally commonplace it was to put a thumb on the scale with regard to racial balancing when you're at the point of hiring. And so the EEOC has come out with two sets of charges against two different institutions, I think really well-chosen institutions. One, of course, Harvard University. And both of these, the second one, I should mention, second one against a scholarship organization that is participated in and funded by 44 of the nation's top law firms. Okay, so top law firms are the guinea pig in the private context, Harvard in the university context. For these cases, both cases, interestingly, very much based on public information that both of these entities put on their websites, where they proudly announced that they were discriminating on the basis of race. So in one case, so at Harvard, it was, quote, increasing the numbers of women, non-binary and people of color on our faculty, right? So they put that language on their website, that it very strongly indicates that they were hiring on the basis of race. Now there'll be a big discovery. Lots of lawsuits will follow these charges brought by the EEOC. And then on the law firm side, 3 white defendants, plaintiffs in this case, sorry, not defendants, 3 white plaintiffs who are alleging that they are discriminated against because this organization that was placing people in very prestigious internships in these law firms that are involved in it on its website says this is only for African Americans, Hispanics, and people of color. This is an internship exclusively for you. Oh, and natives, sorry. So again, clear racist language that says we are going to grant this prestigious employment opportunity only to people of certain ethnic backgrounds. All of this has always been illegal. I testified last year before Congress on this matter, and I suggested, and I have been suggesting for a long time, that this is probably the biggest, most important fertile ground for these kinds, both yanking funding when it comes to universities and actively suing these private companies. There's a reason they're scrambling now to hide all of their 2020 materials, but this applies to basically all of the Fortune 500. This basically every major American corporation came out in 2020 and said, we're going to have 30% of people in our VP ranks are going to be people of color by 2025. You know, they've made a lot of statements that were that precise, statements that would even be out like beyond the pale in the admissions context where it was sanctioned, let alone in Title IX and Title VII context where it's not at all sanctioned to use race at all. So a lot of people have a lot of legal liability here. And I think this is really important to make examples of and as many of these big important companies as possible so that they are afraid to do this in the future. They should be afraid to do this. They should be just as invested in CYA on this as they were in 2020, afraid of BLM and covering their ass in that direction. So this is a great development. Sorry to get into a lot of details here, but I really do think this is probably the best way to go after both universities and the private sector for everything and all the discrimination against whites and males that they clearly were so happy about that they announced on their websites. And these are going to be the most slam dunk cases, frankly, the EEOC has investigated probably in 3 decades.
Yeah, the brazenness of it was what was so shocking to me, because they would have these pictures of their diverse workforce and bragging about the percentage breakdowns of different genders and races. And it's like, okay, well, did that happen by happy accident, or was this engineered in some way? Obviously, the answer is that it was engineered. And it's amazing to see the progression of the types of anti-discrimination cases we saw during the Biden administration to the real anti-discrimination cases we're seeing now. I mean, one of my biggest annoyances, one of the most annoying things that the Biden administration did was he went after this great gas station, Sheetz, which if you're from the Mid-Atlantic, you're probably a Sheetz fan. And after doing a campaign stop at a Sheetz, Biden's civil rights department announced that they were going to be suing the gas station because they had basically a form for hiring employees that asked about criminal history. And they had a policy that they did not hire people who were convicted of certain crimes. And they didn't say specifically what those crimes were, but let's just assume they're violent crimes. They don't hire anybody who's been convicted of a violent crime or is a felon. The Biden administration made the argument that because that has disparate impact, we love that term on this podcast, because it has disparate impact against Black applicants, that Sheetz was being racist by not hiring violent felons. So basically, the Biden administration tried to put the burden of disproportionately high crime rates in the Black community on a gas station who didn't want to hire people who were facing customers who had a criminal history. It was so outrageous, so disgusting. And then, in fact, after the lawsuit was filed, he went back to Sheetz again for another campaign stop. And Kamala Harris won as well for a campaign stop when she became the nominee for the Democrats. So luckily, we have now moved from suing gas stations because they don't want to hire criminals to suing people for actually discriminating explicitly against certain races of people, not disparate impact. So this is wonderful to see, and I appreciate Inez's breakdown very much.
I think this is great. It's interesting. I actually am going all the way to New York to argue the FedSoc about the law firm executive orders, which are related to this, because we've obviously, the Trump administration has put the screws down on a number of law firms, and they're very up in arms about it, threats to the rule of law and all that. But I just remember being in law school and being overtly discriminated against on the basis of race by these very law firms. There are these 1L summer associate positions that are available every year. And, you think, oh, I've got good grades, maybe I should apply to them. And it was just made very obvious that it was common knowledge that those are for underrepresented minorities and that whites need not apply. And that's just one example of the various overt and covert ways that both law schools and law firms were discriminating on the basis of race. Guys, this was all illegal. And now you're paying the piper for it. And all these law firms are now arguing, oh, they're retaliating against us for being liberal. It's like, that may be true, but you've also been violating the law recklessly. So I'm happy to see all these civil rights violations get dealt with.
Just to follow up on Will's story, I talked to a law school friend just a couple weeks ago, and he said just after 2020, a white guy, I'm obviously not going to use his name, but he was explicitly told by his boss in one of these law firms that they had to drop him from a project, like an important project that he was working on, that would have been like a feather in his cap in his resume, because they needed to hire somebody of color on this project. So he was told he was dropped because he was white. Like that was very explicit in these law firms. And again, always illegal.
I think it's worth noting, beyond the insanity that we've illustrated here, that the discrimination and the explicit discrimination on all of these different grounds that are illegal is something that was touted and promoted and was right out in the open. And maybe in 50 years, people will say that was insane. Just like people will talk about the historic discrimination as being insane and monstrous. But the fact that you need the government to sue and to vigorously enforce the law here, it's obvious, but it speaks volumes about the fact that there's massive resistance among all of the elite institutions, clearly, as illustrated here, but beyond as well. This is deeply entrenched within the cultures of these various massive private sector cohorts, or putatively private sector cohorts, whether you're talking about the elite universities or big law firms or in a slew of other industries and the major companies atop those industries. So this is deeply entrenched, and the question is going to be, to what extent do these model cases essentially force these industries to get in line, or are they going to wait it out? And are they going to assume that in 4 years, maybe with a change in administration, it goes right back? And then it also points to the question of, what is it that motivates the leadership at the companies at the end of the day? Are they ideologically themselves captured here, and do they believe essentially in explicit discrimination in hiring practices and beyond? Is it that they're responsive to the subsequent generations? Is that they're cowed by the left? What ultimately causes them to move is a question, and obviously it's going to vary by industry and vary by company or cohort within those various sectors. But this is going to be a long-fought battle, I think, is my takeaway. We've obviously seen how some universities, for example, have tried to skirt the affirmative action ruling at the Supreme Court. Only vigorous enforcement and naming and shaming, I think, will change the culture such that you don't need to have massive prosecutions and public pressure. But it's going to take a long time, I think, because you're talking about institutions that have been captured over many decades, not to mention all of the cohorts whose careers essentially not only the beneficiaries of the policies, direct beneficiaries, but then all of the bureaucracies within all of these institutions that themselves exist precisely because of the discrimination and the need to police explicitly to discriminate. So you have so many different vested interests involved here that only with this kind of vigorous enforcement action are we going to actually see a change, to the extent there isn't a cultural and societal change which says that all discrimination is wrong and the thing that we ought to be discriminating about is merit, is qualifications, is character, and not obviously all of these characteristics that we have no control over.
We are now going to move to final thoughts. I will kick us off. We got the first excerpt from the Jake Tapper, Alex Thompson book on Biden's mental decline this week, and they revealed that staffers were so concerned about Biden's quote unquote stiff gait that they were planning on putting him in a wheelchair if he won re-election. This is shocking, but not surprising for anyone who's been paying attention. I think we've said a lot on this podcast about the deliberate media cover-up of Biden's mental condition and the fact that Jake Tapper was one of the key participants in that. Now that he's profiting off of this book, reporting on it after the fact is disgusting. But there was one little nugget from some of the new reporting that I thought was very interesting, which is that David Plouffe, who was a campaign advisor for Kamala Harris, told the book's authors that Biden essentially effed them by staying in the race too long, and Kamala lost because she had such a short period of time between securing the nomination and election day, which is so delusional that we should be asking if maybe David Plouffe and Kamala Harris have the same mental acuity issues as Joe Biden, because Kamala's poll numbers were the best at the very beginning when Democrats were thrilled that they did not have a corpse running anymore. And there was all of this excitement around the fact that they had a new nominee. And the more that the public got to know Kamala and her policies, whether it was the one she was advocating for on the campaign trail in 2024, or whether it was the ones that she advocated for as a Democratic primary candidate just a few years prior, they liked her a lot less. And her favorability numbers, her poll numbers continued to decline throughout the campaign. So to argue that she needed more time is the exact opposite of what she needed. She needed like a week-long campaign with election day happening the following Tuesday after she secured the nomination, because that was the only shot in hell that she had at beating Donald Trump. So this should not spark optimism in the Democratic Party that these are the excuses being trotted out for Kamala.
So my final thought is just a preview of what I think something we ought to talk about next week, which is that tomorrow, May 15th, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments in the aforementioned birthright citizenship case. We actually don't know precisely what questions the judges want the parties to the case to take up, but the indication is based upon the briefs and what was actually challenged that led to the sort of emergency taking up of this case, that this deals with nationwide injunctions, universal injunctions, which we've talked about ad nauseum here. Obviously, you have the Trump administration, which has basically said the Supreme Court needs to rule on this once and for all. And these cases, because there are three cases that are all consolidated, they're substantially the same on birthright citizenship. These three cases essentially provide a perfect vehicle for the Supreme Court to finally speak once and for all. The universal injunctions that have been imposed not only block the implementation of the birthright citizenship executive order, but even the ability for the relevant agencies to plan for how you would implement the order. So they're very extreme. They're very broad. At minimum, the administration wants Supreme Court to tailor these injunctions and essentially tell the lower courts, no, you can't spread these across the country. Focus on the plaintiffs who were part of the case, as is practical, logical, historically and constitutionally consistent. But the bigger question is going to be, when the administration marshals its arguments about nationwide injunctions, what questions do the justices ask? Who does the asking there? We know, for example, that Justices Thomas, Gorsuch are clearly opposed to nationwide injunctions. I think the real questionable people here are ultimately going to be Roberts and likely Amy Coney Barrett. So we'll see where they go on universal injunctions. And then we'll see on the other side how vigorously they want to defend the notion of universal injunctions. But the arguments of both sides are well known. There have been congressional hearings about these recently. We have legislation pending in the House, passed the House, and we have legislation in the Senate as well to curtail universal injunctions. So the question is going to be, does the court see fit to act, or is it going to narrowly rule again, or not? That is to be seen, but I think the oral arguments here are going to be very telling. And while you shouldn't always read into the questions and who asked them in oral arguments, I think in this one, because some of the justices are already on record about universal injunctions, it's going to be very telling. And if the Supreme Court is going to put an end to judicial insurrectionism, tomorrow really may be the start of it. So let's see what happens, and we'll report on it next week. And maybe also next week talk a little bit about the Middle East. But frankly, I wanted to reserve judgment on the trip and what the takeaways are until the trip is completed. So stand by for more commentary on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about either of those things. I mean, I think I want to jump on what Amber was saying as well. It really is incredible to watch the game that the media is playing, because they want to get the credit for admitting, or like essentially doing a half mea culpa, right? Mea culpa, I should have recognized that Joe Biden was in cognitive decline in 2024. Like, what about 2020? It was obvious then too. It was more subtle. It wasn't as explicit as the guy can't even walk 2 steps, as we were getting to towards the end of 2024, but we knew he was in cognitive decline back then, and you guys were covering for him in 2020 and insulting anybody who dared suggest he was in cognitive decline when he was already saying things like true international depression. Like, wasn't even a word. That was a fall 2020 thing where he couldn't, he was starting to fumble words and not make sense. And, this is the guy who said, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. I still remember that as a 2020 meme. And everybody just kind of put their head down because they knew that the whole goal was to get rid of Trump. So now they're pretending, it's our fault. The only thing they're upset about is that they let Trump win. They were perfectly happy to have a completely imbecilic president as long as Donald Trump wasn't the president. So yeah, I have no patience for these people. I'm going to read Jake Tapper's book because I think it's going to be interesting. But that doesn't mean I think anything higher of Jake Tapper for having written it.
Every time one of these books or a clip from it is written about, somebody should put side by side what they said up until that debate in 2024. Like, it should be emblazoned across the front of their books. Anyway, if we lived in a just universe, I guess just a couple quick hits, because I was hoping Will would bring this up since he tweeted about it. But the biggest underlying problem with the Qatar jet to Trump story is apparently that Boeing cannot build Air Force One on time. This feeds into a larger problem with American manufacturing and our inability to actually fill these orders. I don't know how Boeing is going to build these 160 jets that apparently the Qataris are purchasing from Boeing. If they can't, I understand that Air Force One is an extremely sophisticated, special piece of equipment. But yeah, like, our premier aerospace company cannot fulfill the order for Air Force One. I think they said until like 2035 or some like completely ridiculous, decades out deadline. This was when they were supposed to deliver it. And then just to mention something totally unrelated, just because I think it's worth bringing up, Emily Jashinsky over at Breaking Points got a hold of some really interesting slide decks from Punchbowl in terms of sponsorship opportunities for corporations in legacy media that included doing, a spotlight on a particular issue, right? So they were allowing news organizations, were allowing companies to essentially purchase coverage on a particular issue that they wanted to see in the news. Now, this is just Punchbowl. These documents are just Punchbowl, but it does raise a very interesting question of how much of legacy media coverage is directed by essentially ad buys and by these kinds of direct corporate infusions of money. I mean, quite frankly, I've been working in the nonprofit space most of my life. Like, this is like considered doing this directly with no firewall in between donation and like the coverage. That's even considered kind of déclassé and not right, ethically right, even in an advocacy organization. let alone a news organization. So this is, probably not illegal, but extremely shady and suggestive. And I think it's worth looking into whether this is a business model that was in use beyond punchbowl.
Yeah, it's a great point. And as I remember, Politico, they had a special COVID newsletter in like the first 2 years of the pandemic that was sponsored by Pharma. And I was like, are you effing kidding me? But that's going to do it for us this week. On behalf of Will, Ben, and Inez, I'm Amber Duke, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.